Right, everybody. I have managed to get Dan back, and hopefully we don't lose Dan again. So we will let Dan carry on with his clinic. Over to you, Dan.
Right, thanks very much, Gordy. Right, okay. Subject of today's presentation that I'm going to deliver is airbrushing for railroad modelers. So we're going to cover a few bits and pieces, cover general painting and also a little bit of weathering towards the end. So hopefully you'll find something useful. Okay. Whoops. Sorry, gone through a few there. Go back, go back, go back, go back, go back. Oh, hang about. Sorry about this, guys. Sorry. Okay, first of all, universal disclaimer. Not all techniques, tools, and materials that you will come across in the field of airbrushing will work for you, and that is absolutely fine. What I'll do is the contents of the presentation include some stuff that I've picked up over the years, which I found useful. Again, if you try them out, they may not work for you. You may have a way of doing stuff, and that is absolutely fine. So, why use an airbrush? Pros, if you use an airbrush, you will get quick and smooth application of paint. Generally, there are some guys out there that can produce absolutely exquisite brush painting. Generally, if you use an airbrush, you will get a smoother application of paint. Using airbrush, you can get different finishes that isn't particularly possible with brush painting, particularly if you're after a real true metallic finish for a bare metal look. It's very, very difficult to do that with brush painting. Cons to airbrushing. Requires more time and effort to acquire and develop skills. You may be incredibly lucky and gifted where you can pick up an airbrush from scratch and produce exquisite results on a consistent basis, but that is relatively rare. There is more involved maintenance and cleanup compared with dipping your brush in some thinners or brush cleaner and then a bit of brush soap to keep it in good condition. And again, there's obviously a higher financial investment to buy equipment, more of which we'll come on to a bit later. So types of airbrushes you'll come across. Let's go a little bit where. So first of all, internal mix versus external mix. So external mix tends to be on the cheaper end of the price range. It can be fine, can be very good for sort of scenic things, but by nature of the technology, you tend to get a more coarser grain. Internal mix, again, slightly more expensive, but again, the opposite to external, where the paint's mixed internally, you get a finer spray pattern. So it's better for sort of fine detail and smaller scales. Got to the top, gravity versus bottom feed. So effectively, it's kind of suck versus blow. So gravity feed, the paint's drawn down by gravity and blown through with the airstream. Bottom feed is more of a suction mechanism, so the air is sucked up. At the bottom there, dual or single action. So the airbrush can either work with a single trigger to control the air, and the needle is controlled at the end via a screw. Dual action, both the air and the paint flow are on the trigger, which we'll explore a bit with the next slide. So most double action airbrushes with a top trigger will conform to this kind of setup. So a spring for both the paint flow to control the needle. When you push down on the trigger, that releases the air, as we see here with the spring and the air valve. As you pull back on the rocker, that releases the paint. Also, that isn't shown on here, most airbrushes come with a needle cap that normally fits around here to protect the needle. In most cases, they're removable, which is very good, very useful for if you're doing very, very fine close-up work. it allows you to get in there without any sort of and minimize paint splatter. So, essential equipment. Obviously, first thing is an airbrush. And again, we said you can either have variations in trigger or how the paint feeds. Again, for sort of fine modeling, painting models, a internal feed works better. Again, single action, double action. My personal choice is a dual action. But again, you can get away with a single action, especially if you're starting off and you just want to get used to spraying paint consistently. Again, if you look at airbrushes, they come in a variety of needle sizes. Some of the H&S airbrushes go down to 0.15 needle size, which is probably too small for what you do to spray model paints. They're really designed for artists that spray oils. Again, they can go up to fairly hefty, but again, probably up to 0.5 is a good top end to still keep a nice spray pattern, and allow some detail, but also be able to get paint through, especially if you're modeling in larger scales. When you buy an airbrush, it normally doesn't come with a hose. So most airbrushes on the market come with a 1/8 inch thread, and there are normally a variety. Most airbrush dealers on the internet or shops will sell you a hose. Tend to come in either solid braided, which are more flexible, or you can get them in soft clear plastic. The advantage of the plastic one is, even though it's slightly more rigid, it's useful to be able to see whether or not you're getting condensation coming up the line, which may get into your paint. In terms of manufacturers, any number of manufacturers out there, names that you probably may come across: Badger, Iwata, Mr. Hobby, Japanese, from the makers of Guns Paints, under the name of Procon. Harder and Steenbeck, Pash, Sparmax, you've got Divliblis, a few others out there. With airbrushes, it tends to be you get what you pay for. You can buy very, very cheap airbrushes off of eBay or Amazon, which will normally be Chinese-made clones of either Iwatas or Badgers. By and large, they'll work for probably 3 or 4 times, and then something will break on them. In terms of kind of what your choice is, if you sort of treat automobiles as buying a wreck and run it into the ground, and then you're, quite happy to get rid of it, then yeah, Chinese ones will work for you. If you do want to pay a little bit extra, then you'll get a tool that, if you look after it, will last you a lifetime. Some kind of indicative prices. Entry level, GB pounds, around about 80 quid. And having done a bit of research on the internet, to buy an Iwata Neo is around about $60 in the US. Mid-range, around about £130, $160, and that will get you an Iwata Eclipse HPCS, which is a very nice brush. And high end, around about £200 US dollars, about 250 to get an H&S Infinity CR Plus. Again, if you look on the internet, you can go up to sort of £500-600, but again, for sort of very, very high spec airbrushes. But again, they're ones that are designed for artists and are, will basically be way too refined for what modelers need. But again, if you want to spend the money, there's nothing to stop you to get an absolutely smashing airbrush. Other essential kit, an air supply. Can't really blow paint if you haven't got anything to blow it with. Ideally, a compressor is the way to go forward. And with that, to have a moisture trap with that to catch the condensation that will come out of the compressor or the tank. and also some form of way of regulating your air pressure. So in this particular example, this is a cheap airbrush, cheap compressor on Amazon. So it comes with regulator at the top with the dial. You can lock in to control your air pressure, and a condenser at the bottom to trap any water. At the bottom there's normally a little valve which you can press up, and that blows out any liquid that's in the air, that's in the compressor or in the moisture trap while it's under pressure. Again, so the top section is your compressor, and again, you can normally buy these as a separate unit. This one, however, comes with an air tank, which is really useful, and then you've got a separate vent valve for your air tank. As you got on the slide, air tank's useful. It reduces the strain on the compressor. If it's got an air tank, the compressor will normally run and fill the tank only to fill the tank up and maintain the pressure in the tank. So it's quieter as well. Compressors, most airbrush brands will do market some sort of compressor. Most of them are all made by Sparmax in Taiwan. If you're, and saying Sparmax are a very good make, so it's well recommended. But again, you could go, this is one of the areas where you could get a relatively cheap compressor from eBay, because they all pretty much do the same job. They just might not last quite as long, but it doesn't make a material difference. You can run your airbrush off an aerosol type can type propellant. The drawbacks with these are they're very, very expensive for the amount of spray time you get, and B, certainly when I first started airbrushing and using those, as they run, they get incredibly cold, and the air pressure drops. So you wind up having to stick them in a bath of warm water to stop that happening, to keep the pressure up. So generally, not really. If you're going to do any amount of airbrushing, it's really, really worth investing in a compressor. Right, next bit of essential kit is an extractor. We'll come on to kind of sort of like health and safety stuff a bit later, but unless you are doing tiny amounts of airbrushing, then it's really, really worth investing in an extractor, even if it is a relatively cheap Chinese one, again off of eBay or Amazon. So does what it says on the tin in terms of fan that will pull out particles, normally through a filter. Some of them will, or the majority will vent externally. So you have a hose on the back, which you put through a window or through a washing machine, tumble dryer hole fixing out externally. However, you can get vent extractors that will vent just into a filter internally in the setup. Again, come with disposable filters. Can be quite expensive to buy the recommended stock ones, but again, for some of the more expensive filter units, like the Benchmark over here on the right, you can buy large rolls of filter material that are designed for car or automotive body shops, and basically cut them into shape and put them into the grid you get, and it's a lot cheaper that way. Again, like I say, I've said you get what you pay for. Again, if you're only doing a relatively small amount of spraying, you can get away with a cheaper extractor. But if you're doing a large amount, and especially if you want to start spraying slightly more noxious materials like lacquers, then probably you're looking at sort of £300 sterling or equivalent to get one that's really going to do the job. But again, for that sort of money, you normally get a lifetime guarantee. The other bit of kit is a mask respirator. Again, slightly difficult getting hold of these items at the moment with the current COVID situation. But certainly, if you're going to be thinking of spraying either enamels or lacquers, they're very useful as an additional layer, additional form of protection. In terms of the filters, you need to be a little bit careful to make sure you get the right ones. The more basic ones will only really work for dust, and they're designed for DIY. So make sure you check the spec on your filter units to make sure that they're good for organic and inorganic solvents. In terms of makers, 3M, sort of major manufacturer of them, and certainly in the UK, JSP Force8 are good brands. Okay, stuff that will make your life easier. A Mac valve. So this is the item here on the right. So basically it does what it says. So micro air control valve. So it allows you, rather than having to reach down and twiddle the dial on your compressor, which may be either by your ankles or in another room somewhere, you can change your air pressure on the fly just by turning the knob on the housing in and out. Piece next to it, quick release hose connectors. Again, it's a really useful bit of kit. Rather than having to keep on screwing and unscrewing the airbrush off the end of the hose, you can fit one of these on, and it just pings on and off. So if you're using multiple airbrushes, it's very useful. But even just for getting the airbrush off to clean it up or strip it down, it's a lot easier. And again, both those two items are pretty cheap. So it's around about 15, 10, 15 pounds each. So, and again, you can buy cheap versions, cheap Chinese versions off eBay for probably even less than that. A cleaning pot. Certainly, it makes life a lot easier for cleaning up your airbrush. And also, you've got a little holder, so it doubles up as an airbrush holder. Basically, you fill up the jar, probably about a third full with water. And then when you need to blow your airbrush through, you put your thinners in the top or whatever you're using for cleaning it, and then you can just blast it into the jar. So saves too much in the way of nasty fume going everywhere, or just mess. So well recommended, and again, pretty cheap. Mixing devices. You can use the good old-fashioned screwdriver or cocktail stick or wooden coffee stirrer from Starbucks or your favorite coffee emporium. However, there are a few more kind of slightly more high-tech gizmos available. Badger and Trumpeter both do what is effectively a coffee frother or milk frother for coffee machines, except with more of a spade attachment on the end, which is very good for larger paint jars, so Tamiya, Badger, Polyscale that was. If you're using the kind of dropper bottle styles like Vallejo or AK or Ammo, then if you look on eBay for nail polish shakers, basically it's a sort of vibrating machine with a rubber strap to do nail polish bottles, but they work really well for those dropper types. Again, if you're going to go for the manual route, Tamiya make very, very cheap paint stirrers with a nice flat blade for getting stuff agitated. And again, a little trick that I do for anything that comes in a plastic bottle, I'll add an M4 stainless steel nut as an agitator. You see some of the paint manufacturers like AK and Ammo will sell you ball bearings. The only issue with ball bearings is if you're using the dropper bottles and you actually drop the paint out of the little nozzle, when you turn the paint bottle upside down, the ball bearing will fall down and lodge itself in the paint in the nozzle, and you can't get your paint out. So putting a nut in there means that it's an irregular shape, so you'll still get paint out the bottom. We talked about air tanks on talking about compressors, but again, if you've got a compressor which doesn't come with an air tank, it's possible to buy a standalone air tank and plumb it in with a bit of extra hose or whatever. And again, it's got the benefits of making life a little bit easier and prolonging the life of your compressor a little bit. A couple of other bits which I'll run through quickly. Nitrile gloves. Again, it keeps paint off your hands. while I try to be as careful as possible, I always wind up getting paint on my hands, and because I do it sort of pretty much all day, every day, it's just to try and sort of like stop them getting covered in thinners that dry my skin out. So, and also it helps to keep finger marks and grease off your models. Some sort of mixing vessel. If you're using acrylics, cheap plastic shot glasses are excellent. Again, you can buy them off Amazon or eBay for pence, or again, I can get them. Your kind of Walmart or your local supermarket will probably do them for probably not a lot more than you can get them online. If you're going to use lacquers or enamel, then you're going to need some sort of metal or glass um, jar to mix paint in. I tend to, where I use Tamiya paint, I save the glass jars off the clear coats, and they get reused as mixing jars. Pipettes, again, you can buy these for pence, or sorry, normally sort of like even less than pence on eBay and Amazon. Only disadvantages, obviously, they tend to be single use and therefore not great for the environment, but very useful for taking out small quantities of paint. Some sort of masking medium, masking tape, ideally a low tack one. Tamiya is ideal and very easy to get hold of, and comes in a variety of widths, and they even come in a little dispenser, which is quite handy. Other thing that is useful on occasions is masking fluid, which again is made by most paint manufacturers. Pipe cleaners, again, a bit of an anachronism these days, but they are quite useful, especially if you use a siphon feed for cleaning out the tubes on the siphon feed jars. And brushes for cleaning your airbrush. I've got a huge pile of 1/4 inch round stiff brushes, which are excellent for getting in and cleaning dried paint off color cups and round needles and this kind of thing. Obviously, don't use your best paint brushes that you use for hand painting. Okay, quick run through paints that you might use. So acrylics. So acrylic pigment in a water-based carrier. Pros to these: less or no unpleasant residual smell. Normally pretty quick drying, and being water-based, they are very easy to clean up. You can get away with using warm water with a bit of dish liquid in there if you need to be. Cons tend to be somewhat less hard wearing than lacquer paints or enamels, and they have a larger pigment size, which normally means that ideally you want to go with a slightly larger needle size in your airbrush to make sure they flow properly. Few brands on the market: Badger, Acuflex, Polyscale as was, Model Master as was, Vallejo Air, AK, Enamo, Revell, Rail Match, which is a British brand, and Guns, Japanese, Humbrol, and Life Color, which are Italian. And also should have mentioned Tamiya on there as well, obviously. While most acrylic paint will be a proper acrylic, i.e. it's got a water-based carrier, you come across hybrid acrylics out there which are alcohol-based. So examples of this are the Tamiya X and XF range, and also Guns Mr. Color. Lacquers and enamels. So normally, again, an acrylic pigment, but this time in a mineral spirit-based carrier. Kind of the opposite to your acrylic. So certainly lacquers will give you a very hard finish, but wears very well. Lacquers will be quick drying. And again, they come with a very, very fine pigment, so you can get a very, very good finish on them. Cons, if you use enamels, especially stuff like Humbrol, they take ages to dry. You could be looking at weeks. I think Model Master enamels as well can be very, very slow drying. Because of the nature of their carrier, you get fumes, you get smells, and again, you need some sort of solvent to do cleanup. So again, not great for your lungs if you haven't got proper extraction, and again, not good for particularly good for the environment in terms of waste products. A few brands that probably people recognise: True Colour, Skullcoat 2, Tamiya's LP range, which they've introduced in probably the last year or so. Good old Humbrol, and also Rail Match in the UK do an enamel range as well. So we talked about thinning paint and cleanup. So thinners and additives. When you're spraying, it's normally the sort of fail-safe option is to go for the thinner that's made by your paint brand. For you have true acrylics, you can use distilled water. And again, if you read articles in magazines and on the internet, people use car washer liquid and this kind of thing because it has additives that break down surface tension and also stops bubbling as well. So we talked about using dedicated brands. So again, you can do cross branding on occasion. So Guns thinners works really, really well with alcohol-based paints and lacquers. Retarders, especially if you're spraying in humid areas, a retarder is good to stop the paint drying. Slightly different from retarder is flow enhancer. So again, that's an additive you can put in to reduce surface tension, especially in acrylic paints. Primers, always good. I'd always recommend using some sort of priming coat, either for adhesion or for base color. So again, most paint ranges will do their own primer. Acrylic primers tend to have polyurethane base, so you get very smooth finish. It dries quickly. However, you need to be careful with some of them, especially a good example is the Vallejo one, where if you're using it for picking up sort of like nicks and scratches in the base model, to use it takes quite a long time to dry before you can sand it without it rolling up because it's latex based. Lacquer primers tend to be very, very fine finish, very quick drying, and you get the additional benefit of because they're chemical based, that they'll certainly bite a little bit into plastic to give you a good base. Worth considering what your top color is before you put your primer down. So grey is a good all round for most kind of sort of like medium dark colors. If you're going to go over with yellows and oranges, especially if you're as a BNSF modeler, that tends to be my port of call, to put white down, which works well with that. And if you're want a metallic finish, if you put black down, it works in the same way as a mirror in terms of having a black surface for the metallics to reflect back off of. Clear coats, again, most paint ranges will do a gloss, a semi, and a matte. And again, it's worth going over to provide protection for weathering or decals. And also you can use it for a bit of masking, as we'll come on to later. Right, sorry guys, I'm going to speed up a bit because that's a little bit behind. Right, health and safety. So first thing, the air that I breathe. Acrylics. There is a little bit of a misnomer out there that acrylics are, for want of a better word, safe. Yes and no. They're not as bad as spraying lacquers or enamels, but you've still got atomized particles floating around in the air which are not designed to go into your lungs, so they won't do you the world of good. So again, ideally you want the minimum of a mask and ideally an extractor. It's worth bearing in mind that anything except true acrylics, i.e. water-based ones, are flammable. If you look at the jar of a Tamiya X or XF paint, it's got a flammable symbol on it, certainly in the EU, which means it will go up in smoke. And again, be wary of most thinners, especially of the on the lacquer side, will be inflammable. Under pressure, you get condensation buildup if you've got a tank on your airbrush, on your compressor. So you need to remember to bleed your tank regularly. On an extreme level, you can get a situation where if your tank rusts out from the inside, you've effectively got a small explosive device potentially sitting at your ankles that may blow up. Getting to the point, obviously, airbrushes have needles, which, especially if you're using smaller size ones, can be extremely sharp and tend to hurt if you drop them on your toes. The last one, there are anecdotal stories out on the internet of instances where homemade extractors that use unshielded motors have exploded when using lacquer paints, where the gas and particles being sucked through have been ignited by a spark coming off the motor. I've never heard of anything personally, but it's just one of those things to bear in mind. And if you do buy a commercial extractor from a reputable company, that won't be a problem because they'll have shielded motors. Okay, airbrush variables. 3 things to remember when you're airbrushing. You have a combination of air pressure, distance to model, and paint viscosity. And ideally, you need to be in the middle of that. Again, air temperatures and humidity will also play a part on that in terms of how quickly your paint dries. Paint and thinner ratios. Most lacquer and the majority of acrylic paints these days come airbrushed ready. So i.e. you should be able to stick those straight in your airbrush without any problems. The only drawback with acrylics is over time, once they've been opened, they will tend to thicken up. So you still need to sort of, if you've had a paint for a while, you still need to check that it's good to go, and you may need to use a bit of thinners. General rule of thumb is you want the consistency of semi-skim milk, or else if you're using clear shot glasses to mix your paint, if you swill the paint round the outside of your mixing cup, hold it up to the light and put your finger behind. If you can see your finger through the paint, then it normally means that it's thin enough. As you say, referring to the previous article, because you've got various combinations of factors, paint ratios are not an exact science. So a lot of paint manufacturers where paint does need thinning will quote a ratio. It's useful as a kind of ballpark, but don't treat it as gospel. Similarly, air pressure, again, don't treat it as an exact science. So again, quoted air pressures should be taken on advisement, but again, where you've got either a MAC valve or the adjustment on your pressure, you've got a pressure gauge on your extractor, then you may need to play with that around what the manufacturers recommend. Ballpark pressures that I use is around about 25 psi for acrylics and around about 10 to 15 psi for lacquers. Again, one of the big things that I picked up from another airbrusher that I follow on the internet was using your common sense. So if you're painting and you're suddenly getting kind of clouds of, even if your pressure is relatively low, but you're still getting clouds of paint from paint bouncing off the model, then your pressure is normally too high. So, dial it down a little bit. Similarly, if you sort of like you're testing your flow before you start spraying and your airbrush is kind of sounding really rough and it's spitting and, not sounding great, you're not getting a nice even flow, then you're probably spraying too low. And I've got here again, before you do anything at all, test your flow on a bit of cardboard or a bit of plastic card or something, just to make sure you're getting something you're happy with. Okay, can't emphasize this enough, practice. You get an airbrushing, you to airbrushing, practice. Even if you're kind of a dab hand, it's always worth keeping your hand in, keeping the axe sharp. So always have, a store of scrap loco bodies, freight cars. If you look online, there are loads of exercises around dots and linking dots, spraying lines. There's a dagger exercise where you basically start off with a larger dot and then go to small. And again, a fun one is to try and write your name with your airbrush as finely as possible. Another tip that I picked up when I first started out was using liquid food coloring rather than paint to practice. So it's pre-thinned, doesn't produce anything particularly nasty in the air, and it's incredibly easy to clean up with just a bit of hot water. So getting to the sharp end here. So prep before you start spraying. So clean, make sure your spray area is clean. If you've got anything masked, make sure that you've burnished the edges down of your masking tape with a cocktail stick. Make sure your model is clean and free from dust, so you can use tack cloths that you'd use for decorating, or Tamiya, or a few people you can get an anti-static brush. Tamiya do one of those. Good idea if you've got extractors to run it for 10 minutes before you start, so it sucks out any dust or particles that are sitting in your spray booth. And again, before you start, it's a good idea just to blow your airbrush through with a bit of thinners of whatever paint you're going to use, just to make sure that after you cleaned it last time that you didn't leave anything in there and it's blocked up. Mixing paint. So that's one of the crucial things. So mix until you think your paint is mixed. Probably a good sort of maybe, well, it's probably 4 to 5 minutes, maybe a bit OT, especially if we're using a mechanical mixer, but probably a good sort of like 3-4 minutes, and then mix it a bit more for good measure just to make sure you're okay. We talked about pipettes. Again, pipettes are ideal for getting paint out of your paint jar. If you're like me, you've got paint that you use for brush painting as well as airbrushing. You potentially wind up with getting rim grot round the edge. And if you pour your paint out of your jar, you've got a better chance of getting that grot and particles going down into your airbrush, which will block your needle. One thing I can't emphasize, I'd never ever mix paint and thinners in your airbrush paint cup. If you're using hopefully some sort of like clear jar or the shot glass or whatever, when you mix your paint, at least you can see what's going on there. So if you get some sort of bad reaction from a bad batch of paint or thinner, and the paint goes gritty or horrid, and it just isn't nice. If you've got it in a glass jar or a shot cup, you can see what's going on. If you're doing it in your airbrush paint cup, chances are you're not going to see that, and all you're going to do is then blow that through up your needle, and then you've got a blockage which you'll have to clean out and start again. And again, before you get anywhere near a model, test your flow to make sure. So 2 or 3 passes to make sure that the paint's flowing nicely and you're happy. Basic technique, which probably a lot of you have seen a million times before. So first of all, start with air on, and then pull paint on, then move across your model, making sure you keep the airbrush parallel to the model, and then as you come off, turn the paint off. But again, I normally keep my airflow on. What that does, certainly with acrylics, is helps to avoid getting dry paint on the needle tip. Right.
Hi, Dan.
Yep.
Can we get you to wrap up, because we've got a few questions to go, and we're pushing 10
Yeah.
to the hour now, and
Yep. Sure. No
we'd like to
worries.
get to them. Thanks.
Yeah. No worries. Okay, so there's a few things about basically making sure you're comfortable with the way you grip your airbrush. Masking, paint over masking, as the diagram says, try and spray across the mask. If you spray the other way, then you've got the risk of blowing paint under your mask. Clean up, touched on that. So basically the way that I do it is dump your paint that you've got left in the cup, a bit of cleaner, put your brush in, give it a wash round, do the needle, dump that, then blow through into your cleaning jar with fresh thinners. Maintenance cleanup, seals, just be aware that some cheaper airbrushes only come with rubber seals, and if you put lacquers through them, they'll expand and you get blockages and stuff like that. The more upmarket airbrushes come with Teflon seals you don't have to worry about. It's worth also lubrication, so needle juice or needle lube, which the airbrush manufacturers sell at the front end. And for your air valves and trigger, I use a little bit of light oil, like Labelle, but very, very small amounts. Needles and nozzles, always treat with care. I always keep a spare set. Nothing more annoying than if you decide to drop your needle while you're cleaning it and you bend it, then you're stuck waiting for a new needle to come through the post. Most common problem you'll come across with acrylics would be dry tip. Rough paint, orange peel, you're basically too far away, your air pressure's too high. Paint stopping and starting, you've either not mixed it properly. Dry paint, again, it's clean up. Do we want to stop there? Because I'm just going to go on to some weathering after this. Which is
Yeah,
kind of,
we unfortunately
yeah.
we don't have time, so
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
gonna
let's
have
kill it.
to
Okay.
stop if you can, and then we'll
Yeah,
get
yeah,
some
let's
questions.
go. Yeah, I'll take questions. Not a problem.
So we can
Oh,
stop
sorry,
your share.
Yep, sorry.
That's all right.
Right. Let's kill that. Okay.
Okay, you throw your camera back on, and
Okay, we'll see. Hopefully my internet won't go
there
down.
we go. Perfect. One question: have you ever used a CO2 tank? Somebody's read you don't have pressure or problems with pressure and moisture using one.
No, haven't, to be honest. So,
Okay.
sounds
Short
like a
and
winner.
sweet. Somebody finds cleaning their airbrush tedious and annoying. Any advice on how to make clean up my airbrush faster? Hints or tips?
Yeah, I mean, if you follow that one, that will normally take me probably no more than 3 or 4 minutes to clean up. So it's basically the easiest way is once you finish painting, dump any paint out of your color cup first, put thinners in, give that a whiz round to get all the grot out of your color cup, dump that, and then put more thinners or cleaner in, and then blow that through. So effectively you're only blowing the bare minimum of old paint through your needle.
Okay. Somebody would comment, be very careful if you're sharing a dryer vent, if you have a gas dryer, because if the vapors build up in the dryer, which they will, you stand a chance of an explosion. So
Oh
that's,
yes, yeah.
if
Sorry,
you're using an airbrush booth or something like that, don't run it through your dryer vent right to the outside or
yeah.
that type
Sorry,
of thing.
yeah. What I meant was you've got a separate housing.
Yeah, it's a
that you would
separate
do
housing,
yeah,
similar
so,
to what the dryer is. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
All right, and I'll just make one comment. I know our friends over at Model Railroad Hobbyists have a pretty good free publication on their website about airbrushing with acrylics, and a good forum that goes along with that. You just need to sign up, and it's free download. It's a very interesting sort of the post flow cool thing.
Can recommend that.
Yeah,
very good.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Appreciate it. It was a very interesting clinic. So everybody who now has an airbrush is going to get it out, mix some paint, find some scrap materials to practice on, and then they'll be experts at painting. So we appreciate your clinic, and thank you very much on behalf of Gateway X.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
And
Cheers. Bye.
See you in a few hours.